Alright, yeah, welcome back to some more Magic Arena, and by popular request, we're coming back with an old archetype, one that I've had many comments about returning to as sets have come out, and up until this point I haven't really found a reason to come back to it up until this point, really. Ended up building a brand new deck of blue-white wizard tempo. So this is a change on the mono-blue wizards deck, and as you can maybe tell, it's changed quite a lot from the previous version. In fact, the win conditions are kind of completely different altogether. And before we get into the actual deck tech, I know one thing you're all going to mention. I'm just going to get it out there right now. All of you, I'm sure, are going to say, Tom, why haven't you changed your basic land art? You're absolutely right. I completely forgot to do that. So probably for the games, the basic lands are going to change. Don't worry at all. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the deck. So Wizard Tempo is exactly as you imagine. It's a tribal deck that revolves around using creatures that enter the battlefield to give us big tempo swings. So the card that we're actually built around specifically is Naban, Dean of Iteration. 2 mana for a 2/2/1. If a wizard entering the battlefield under your control causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So basically, we double up our enter the battlefield effect. So things like Augur of Bolas, a 2 mana 1/3, sorry. When it enters the battlefield, you get to look at the top 3 cards of your library and get an instant or sorcery card from them. With Naban, we get to double that, so we get to go 6 cards deep and potentially draw 2 cards for a 2 mana 1/3. It's pretty sweet. We're also running a copy of Omen Speaker as well, kind of the same sort of thing, 2 mana 1/3. However, this one scries 2, and we can scry 2 twice, so we can go 4 cards deep with the Omen Speaker. Make sure that we know exactly what's on top of our deck and be drawing what we like. We're going to be triggering the ETBs as well with some flicker spells here as well. Justicious Portal, 2 mana, 1 and a white, instant speed. Exile target creature you control, then return that creature to the battlefield under its owner's control. It gains first strike until the end of the turn. So we can reuse all of our enter the battlefield effects. We can go 6 cards deep with the Augur of Bolas, or 4 cards deep on the Scry with the Omen Speaker for 2 mana, which is pretty sweet. So Augur of Bolas can potentially just replace the portal and get another card. We can also double bounce creatures. We can Deputy of Detention, and this is one of the biggest swings that we can have in the deck. 3 mana for a 1/3. When it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls, and all other non-land permanents that player controls with the same name as that permanent until Deputy of Detention leaves the battlefield. So one of the big things that you could do with this one is like hit the Biogenic Ooze with a double trigger, which means we can take both the Ooze and the Ooze token simultaneously, and it'll get rid of all copies of that card, which is really good. It is an absolute monster for destroying tokens, so it's one way to wipe a board with this deck. So we're running all 4 copies of that, especially in light of having a lot of Planeswalkers rolling around. Being able to take 2 Planeswalkers with 1 Deputy Detention is very good. We also have many ways to protect all of these things as well. Since Naban is an engine piece we want to keep around, and Deputy is something we don't want to have killed and our opponent get our stuff back, we have plenty of ways to do that. One is obviously to flicker in response, which is quite nice, but also Dive Down, a 1 mana instant speed. Target creature you control gets +0/+3 until the end of the turn, and hexproof, which means it can't be targeted or it'll fizzle a spell that our opponent tries to cast upon it. And then we also have 4 copies of Wizard's Retort as well as a counter spell, stop any board wipes coming along, and it gets a 1 mana cost reduction, so it's just a blue counter target spell with this deck in place. So super solid counter spells there. We also have Kasmina to protect as well. 4 mana, 5 loyalty Planeswalker. Spells your opponents cast that target a creature or Planeswalker you control cost 2 more to cast. So basically, our opponent's Mortifies will cost 5 mana to attack our creatures, which means that there's a good chance that they can't respond after we go with our counter spells or our dive downs, things like that, because it'll just cost them too much. We can also use the -2 there to create a 2/2 blue wizard creature token to draw a card and discard a card, so one way of filtering through our deck to find the pieces that we need. Unfortunately, the wizard itself doesn't get that ability to loot, so Naban isn't going to double trigger the token, unfortunately. Would be really nice, but maybe a bit too powerful, who knows. But yeah, she stays around as a 1 loyalty planeswalker from that point forward, so her passive is still in effect even after we get those 2 blue wizard creature tokens, which is very nice. We also have Elite Guard Mage as well, a 4-mana 2/3 with flying. When it enters the battlefield, you get 3 life and draw a card. This is our way of beating the aggro decks in a sense. It's also really absurd with Naban. If we can get a double trigger on the Elite Guard Mage, we gain 6 life and draw 2 cards for 4 mana. And once it's down, of course, we can say that we can do that for 2 mana with the Justicia's Portal and Time Twist. So we're running a 4 and 2 on these cards as well. You may notice, I think Justicia's Portal is just a little bit better because it brings back the creature immediately and gives it first strike as well, so it can be a bit of a combat trick in that sense as well. Whereas Time Twist actually performs the job a little bit differently. Same thing, but in blue. We exile the target permanent, which actually means we can exile the Planeswalkers if they're going to die and bring them back on their base loyalty. So we can reset Kasmina as an example. She'll come back as 5 loyalty, and we get to make some more tokens yet again, which is quite nice. But it's also board wipe protection as well in a certain sense. So we can use Teferi's Time Twist on Naban, let's say, and it will come back on the end step instead of immediately, which means if our opponent goes with a Kaya's Wrath or something like that, we can take Naban out of play, our opponent will Wrath the board, and then on our end step we'll get a creature back, and it'll come back with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So it has its uses. There are certain scenarios where one is better than the other, but I think this split right here is where I'm happy with it, to be perfectly honest. So that's what we're going to go with in the end. We also have Exclusion Mage as well. I don't know if I've talked about this one. 3 mana 2/2, ends the battlefield, you return a creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand, doubled up with Naban. Pretty sweet to just double bounce, and it's the tempo swing you're really looking for. So the idea is that we're going to slow our opponent down by making all of the things that they play pretty worthless while also adding to our board. That's the idea of tempo, is add something to the board while taking something away from our opponent. So in the Exclusion Mage's case, we put a 2/2 down and we bounce one of their bigger creatures, let's say, something that costs them a lot, so they have to recast it the turn after. The mana base is pretty simple. We've got 4 Glacial Fortress, 4 Hollowed Fountains, 4 Plains and 11 Islands. We are mostly a blue deck as it might appear. We only splash white for the Portal, the Deputy, the Guard Mage, and that's basically it. So, you know, we're only needing 1 white mana, maybe 2 at a push throughout the entire game, so we're relying mostly on our dual lands to get our white mana, and for the rest of it, we just need the 11 islands. Wizard's Retort being a double blue is very important that we have that available as and when we draw that card. So that's the main deck. Moving on to the sideboard, we have 2 copies of Spell Pierce. So in the early game with removal decks, 1 blue to counter a non-creature spell, unless its controller pays 2. Very nice with the Kasmina, who is also adding an additional cost to the card. So as I mentioned, things like Mortify cost 5 mana. So when we Spell Pierce, it's as good as a counter spell in that sense as well. We can also basically counter things on curve as well. So if our opponent's trying to play their Teferi on 5, we can get rid of that no problem at all. 1 copy of Silent Gravestone to take care of the Command the Dreadhorde decks. 1 mana, cards in graveyards can't be the target of spells or abilities, so we can nerf the Tamio, who can't mine us to get cards out of the graveyard anymore. Command the Dreadhorde can't target things in graveyards either. Eldest Reborn, Fizzles on the 3rd chapter, things like that. So there's a lot of uses for Silent Gravestone, although I'm not really that impressed with going for an additional Silent Gravestone here. I think just having 1 is perfectly fine, because we have a lot of ways to deal with that deck as well, but this one kind of hoses the list. The only problem being Teferi on 3 is able to bounce the Silent Gravestone, so I'm not going to rely on it too much. I'm more going to rely on counter magic. Speaking of, we got 3 copies of Dovin's Veto as well. 1 white and 1 blue for an instant speed. This spell can't be countered. Counter target non-creature spell. So stop board wipes, stop planeswalkers, stop Ixalan's bindings, whatever. We just really want to have this one for the control matchup, so that's what we're doing it for. 2 copies of Diamond Mare, we're using this one for the red matchups, or the aggro in general. 2 mana of any colour for a 1/3. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a colour. We're always going to choose blue, because every single card in our deck, except for the Justicia's Paw, is blue, so it should trigger off of virtually everything. And whenever you cast a spell of the chosen colour, you gain 1 life, so it's a nice little swing for us here. Against the red decks, they're going to be wanting to fire off lightning strikes on this Diamond Mare, and we can spell Pierce, gain a life, and stop them from killing it, that kind of thing. They'll probably work on it quite a lot. We only actually need the Diamond Mare up until the point where we can resolve a Guard Mage, because gaining 3 life, gaining 6 with Naban is really good, and being able to flicker this is just horrendous for mono red, so that's kind of what we're going for with the Diamond Mare. We have 1 Elite Guard Mage. 4 mana for a 2/3 when it enters the battlefield, gain 3 life and draw a card. Yep, it's the 4th copy for the aggro matchups yet again. Also, if card draw matters, then we want to bring it in for that one. And 3 copies of Time Wipe. This one's actually an interesting one for the list, because you might imagine as a tempo list, we don't really want to be wiping our own board, but we're running 3 copies of Time Wipe in the sideboard for matchups where go wide strategies are a little bit of a problem for us. So 2 double white and a blue, sorcery speed. Return a creature you control to its owner's hand, then destroy all creatures. So if our opponents are producing too many creatures for us to deal with, or they have hexproof creatures or enter the battlefield creatures that we don't want to bounce or deputy, then we use Time Wipe to just reset the board. We also get to bounce a creature of our choice back to our hand as well, so we're not completely losing our entire board state. We can still bring back our Naban. We can also bring back our Deputy, which releases everything from under it. So if our opponent has 2 of their creatures underneath Deputy, we can give those back to them, and then Time Wipe resolves and kills the creatures. So we basically get a reset on our Deputy to allow us to reuse it. So there is actually a lot of utility for Time Wipe here, and it's just useful for the creature matchups where we can't really keep up with their creature base. Finally, 2 copies of Entrancing Melody, just so that we can take some big creatures from our opponent. X, double blue, gain control of target creature with converted mana cost X. This is here for the Hydroid Krasis, so we only have to pay 4 mana to take their biggest Hydroid Krasis, so we could get an 8/8 for 4 mana. We can also use it on Wild Growth Walker as well to stop the Explore or get their big creature. There's lots of things in these low converted mana cost area where we can actually get a huge creature for a big tempo swing. So Entrancing Melody is coming in over that one. I considered Mass Manipulation, but I think the quad blue and the double X is just a little bit too much for this kind of deck, because we're only running 23 lands. We're not really going to be able to get into that point where, you know, we can actually pay double X multiple times to take multiple things. So I think just taking 1 with Entrancing Melody is going to do us just fine. And that's essentially the deck, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. It is a lot of fun to play. It's not a very forgiving deck as well, so if you are a beginner or not particularly good at Magic, this one's going to be a little bit of a struggle for you, I would imagine. I'm guaranteed to make a few misplays along the way, as I mentioned, for exactly that reason. It's a big brain deck. But yeah, like any one mistake could lose you the game, so take your time when you make your plays. Hopefully I'll be doing the same thing during the matchups. But yeah, other than that, guys, I hope you enjoy the matchups. Should be going live at the same time as this video as well. If you could as well, it helps out a great deal if you hit that like button and subscribe as well for some more Magic content in the future, as well as hitting that little bell icon as well. It'll give you the notifications you need to let you know when my videos go live in the future. I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.